The morning Lady Eleanor Ashford decided to destroy her life. The sky over the Scottish Highlands was the color of a fresh bruise. She stood in the hallway of Thornwick Manor, her mother's shrill voice cutting through the walls like a blade. Another suitor was coming, the fourth this month. This one was different, her mother insisted. This one owned half of Edinburgh and had already buried 2 wives, which meant he knew how to be a proper husband. Eleanor felt her stomach turn. She was 23 years old, and she was running out of time. In her world, that meant she was running out of value. Her father had been dead for 18 months, and with him had gone any illusion that the Ashford family was anything more than a crumbling name attached to an empty bank account. The manor was mortgaged. The staff had been reduced to a cook, and a housekeeper, and a stable boy who was likely stealing oats. Her mother's solution was simple and surgical. Marry money. Marry it fast. Marry it before the creditors came knocking and the neighbors started whispering. Eleanor had watched 3 men parade through their drawing room in as many weeks. Men with soft hands and hard eyes. Men who looked at her the way her father used to look at his prized hunting dogs, evaluating her teeth and her temperament and her breeding potential. The last one, Lord Pemberton, had actually asked her mother if Eleanor was good with children before bothering to speak to Eleanor herself. She had smiled politely through the entire ordeal, her face aching from the effort, while inside she screamed. That night, alone in her father's old study, thus Eleanor made a decision that would have horrified every woman in her social circle. She was going to marry someone completely unsuitable, someone poor, someone so far beneath her station that her mother would have no choice but to leave her alone forever. She would ruin herself on purpose, and in doing so, she would finally be free. The plan was reckless and desperate and possibly insane, but Eleanor had inherited her father's stubbornness along with his debts, and once the idea took root, she couldn't let it go. She spent 2 sleepless nights working out the details, pacing her bedroom until the floorboards creaked in protest. She would need to meet someone quickly, someone with no connections to her social world. A tradesman, perhaps, or a farmer. There's someone kind enough not to mistreat her, but poor enough to appall her mother into disowning her entirely. The universe, as it turned out, had different plans. On a frozen Thursday morning, Eleanor wrapped herself in her plainest cloak and slipped out of Thornwick Manor before sunrise. She told no one where she was going because no one would have let her go. The village of Braemar was 3 miles down the rutted country road, far enough from the manor that she could move without being recognized immediately. She had been there only twice in her life, both times in her father's carriage, but she remembered it as a place where people worked with their hands and didn't care much about titles. The walk took longer than she expected. Her boots, made for drawing rooms and garden strolls, yet were not built for the frozen mud of a highland road in February. By the time she reached the village, her feet were numb, and her breath came out in clouds. The main street was quiet, just a few shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, and a farmer loading a wagon with hay bales. Eleanor stood at the edge of the square, suddenly unsure of what to do next. She had imagined this moment 100 times, but now that she was here, the absurdity of her plan hit her like cold water. What was she supposed to do? Walk up to a stranger and propose marriage? Ask the blacksmith if he was interested in a bankrupt aristocrat with no dowry and a mother who would curse his name for generations? She was about to turn back when she heard the sound of hooves on cobblestone. A man rode into the square on a mud-splattered horse, and his posture straight despite the obvious exhaustion in his shoulders. He wore the dark uniform of a British infantryman, though it was faded and patched in places, and his face was shadowed by several days' worth of beard. He dismounted in front of the inn, with the careful movements of someone whose body had learned not to trust solid ground. Eleanor found herself staring. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with the kind of face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. There was a scar along his jawline, pale and thin, and his hands, as he tied the reins to the post, were calloused and steady. He moved like a man who had seen things he would never speak about, and when he glanced up and caught her watching him, his eyes were the color of a winter sea. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Yet then Eleanor did something she would never be able to fully explain, not even to herself. She stepped forward, her heart hammering so hard she thought he might hear it, and she spoke. "Excuse me, are you married?" The soldier blinked, clearly startled. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the way his jaw tightened, as if he was bracing for an attack. He looked at her like she might be a hallucination brought on by too many nights sleeping on frozen ground. "I beg your pardon?" Eleanor's hands were shaking inside her cloak, but her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need to know if you're married. It's important." The man stared at her for a beat too long, his expression caught between confusion and suspicion. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No, I'm not." Eleanor took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "Good," she said, "because I have a proposition for you." The soldier didn't laugh, which Eleanor took as a small miracle. He stood there in the frozen square, one hand still resting on his horse's neck, studying her with the kind of careful attention men learned in war. His eyes moved from her face to her cloak, taking in the fine wool that she'd tried to hide beneath a layer of road dust, the way her posture gave away years of deportment lessons, even as she tried to seem ordinary. "A proposition," he repeated, his voice rough like gravel underfoot. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man who had heard too many propositions in his life, none of them good. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold. This was madness. She knew it was madness. But turning back now would mean returning to Thornwick Manor, to her mother's plans, to Lord Pemberton's tobacco-stained smile, and the slow suffocation of a life chosen by someone else. "I need to marry someone," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Quickly. Someone who won't ask questions or expect anything beyond a legal arrangement. In return, I can offer you a modest sum. Not much, but enough to start over somewhere, if that's what you need." The soldier's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He glanced past her, scanning the square as if checking for witnesses, or perhaps looking for whoever had put her up to this cruel joke. When he looked back at her, there was something harder in his face. "You're serious? Completely? You're running from something?" It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Eleanor became aware of how loud her own heartbeat sounded in her ears. A cart rattled past behind them. Somewhere a dog barked, the ordinary sounds of a village morning, while she stood in the middle of it asking a complete stranger to upend both their lives. "What's your name?" he asked finally. Eleanor hesitated. Giving him her real name meant risk, but lying seemed like a poor way to begin an arrangement built on mutual desperation. "Eleanor Ashford." She watched his face carefully for recognition, for the change that always came when people heard the Ashford name. But there was nothing. Either he didn't know the family, or he didn't care. Both possibilities felt like relief. "I'm James," he said. "James Mackenzie. And I think you should go home, Miss Ashford. Whatever you're running from, marriage to a soldier with nothing but a tired horse and borrowed time isn't going to solve it." The rejection stung more than Eleanor expected. She had prepared herself for suspicion, even mockery, but not for gentle dismissal. Not for someone to look at her desperate plan and try to protect her from it. "You don't understand," she said, and hated how her voice wavered. "Going home isn't an option. My mother is determined to sell me to the highest bidder, and I won't do it. I won't spend my life as some old man's decorative investment. If I marry you, marry anyone she considers unsuitable, she'll wash her hands of me entirely. I'll be disowned, but I'll be free." James shifted his weight, and Eleanor saw him wince slightly, some old injury making itself known. "And what happens to you after that? When you're disowned and married to a man with no prospects? Have you thought about what freedom costs when you can't afford bread?" "I've thought about it every night for 2 weeks," Eleanor said, and the honesty of it rang in the cold air between them. "I know what I'm asking. I know how it sounds. But I also know that if I don't do something now, I'll wake up one morning 20 years from now in a house I hate, married to a man I despise, wondering when exactly I stopped being a person and became a thing to be managed." James studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away. There was something ancient in his eyes, yet the kind of weariness that had nothing to do with age. She wondered what he had seen in the war, what he had done, what he was trying to forget. "I can't give you the life you're used to," he said quietly. "I have a small cottage on the edge of nowhere. No servants, no society, barely enough to keep the roof from leaking. That's not freedom, Miss Ashford. That's just a different kind of prison." "It's my choice of prison," Eleanor said. "That's the difference." Something flickered across James's face then. Recognition, maybe. Or respect. He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars that marked years of hard living, and Eleanor saw him weighing something she couldn't name. "Why me?" he asked. "There are other men in this village, men who might jump at the chance to marry an Ashford, even a disgraced one." Eleanor had asked herself the same question in the 30 seconds since she'd first seen him. The truth was complicated and instinctual and impossible to explain. Something about the way he carried himself, the way he hadn't looked at her like a prize or a puzzle to solve, the exhaustion in his shoulders that matched the exhaustion in her chest. "Because you look like someone who understands what it means to want out," she said simply. James met her eyes, and for the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was gone before Eleanor could be sure she'd seen it, but it left behind a warmth she felt in her frozen fingers. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it properly. Legal documents, witnesses, a real marriage in the eyes of the law, even if it's an empty one. I won't have you trapped in some arrangement you can't escape if things go wrong." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't realized had been clenched tight since her father died. "Agreed." James held out his hand, rough and scarred and steady. Eleanor took it, and his grip was warm despite the cold. "Then I suppose we're getting married, Lady Eleanor." She smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. "Just Eleanor," she said. "I'm about to lose the title anyway." The wedding took place 3 days later in a stone church so small it could barely hold a dozen people. Eleanor wore a simple dress of deep blue wool, borrowed from the innkeeper's wife, who had taken pity on her story, or at least the version of it Eleanor had carefully constructed. James stood beside her in his cleaned uniform, at the patches less noticeable in the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. The priest, an elderly man with kind eyes and trembling hands, spoke the words that would bind them together, and Eleanor felt the strange weight of it settle over her shoulders like a cloak. When James slipped the ring onto her finger, a plain silver band he'd purchased from the village blacksmith, Eleanor noticed his hands weren't shaking at all. Hers were. They walked out of the church into afternoon sunlight that felt impossibly bright. Eleanor had written her mother a single letter, delivered that morning, explaining in precise and unapologetic terms what she had done. She imagined her mother reading it over breakfast, the teacup shattering against the floor, the shrieking that would rattle the windows of Thornwick Manor. What the thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like exhaling after holding her breath for years. James's cottage was exactly as he'd described it. Small, isolated, perched on a hillside overlooking a valley that stretched toward mountains still capped with snow. The roof didn't leak badly, just in one corner that James had marked with a bucket. There was a stone fireplace, a wooden table with two mismatched chairs, and a bed that James immediately insisted Eleanor take while he fashioned himself a pallet by the fire. "We had an agreement," he said when she protested. "A legal marriage, but not that kind. You keep the bed. I'll manage fine." Eleanor wanted to argue, but the exhaustion of the past few days caught up with her all at once, and she simply nodded. The first week passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. James woke before dawn and worked on repairs to the cottage that Eleanor suspected he was inventing to stay busy. She learned to cook simple meals over the fire, burning more than she succeeded at first, but gradually finding a competence she'd never needed in her old life. They spoke politely to each other, like friendly strangers sharing a coach, never quite sure how much honesty the situation allowed. Eleanor found herself watching him when he didn't notice, the way he moved with purpose even in small tasks, the gentleness in his hands when he coaxed the fire back to life each morning, the nightmares that woke him gasping in the dark, though he always pretended he'd simply gotten up for water. It was on the 8th night, as they sat by the fire after supper, that Eleanor finally asked the question that had been building in her chest. "What are you running from, James?" He looked up from the piece of wood he'd been whittling, surprised. Then something resigned crossed his face, as if he'd been expecting this conversation and dreading it in equal measure. "The same thing you are," he said quietly. "Expectations. A life that was chosen for me before I was old enough to have an opinion about it." Eleanor set down her mending. "I don't understand." James was quiet for a long moment, the knife still in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like a man crossing a frozen river. "My full name is James Alexander Mackenzie, the Duke of Strathmore." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and absurd. Eleanor stared at him, waiting for the joke to land, but his face remained serious. "That's not funny," she said. "No," James agreed. "It's not." He told her the rest then, the words coming slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. He'd inherited the title at 19 when his father died, suddenly responsible for estates and tenants and a position in society he'd never wanted. He'd fled into the army, using a false name, desperate for something real, something that had nothing to do with bloodlines and expectations. The war had been brutal and clarifying, and when it ended, he couldn't bring himself to go back. So he'd stayed James Mackenzie, common soldier, living in a cottage on land he technically owned, hiding from a dukedom that was still waiting for him in a manor house 3 valleys away. "I saw you in that square," he said, meeting her eyes. "Desperate and brave and trying so hard to escape, and I recognized it. That look. I've seen it in my own mirror for years." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight since her father died. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed someone unsuitable," James said simply. "And I needed someone who wanted me for the wrong reasons, which somehow felt like the only honest reasons left." Eleanor started to laugh then, a sound that surprised them both. It built in her chest until tears streamed down her face. And James was staring at her like she'd lost her mind. which only made her laugh harder. "We're both fools," she gasped finally. "I married a poor soldier to escape wealth, and you married an aristocrat to escape a title. We're absolutely mad." James smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Completely mad. Eleanor wiped her eyes, her breath still hitching with leftover laughter. "So what do we do now?" James set down his whittling and moved to sit beside her on the hearth. He took her hand, the same way he had in the village square, and his touch was warm and certain. "I think," he said slowly, "we stay here, in this cottage, with the leaking roof and the uneven floor. We stay James and Eleanor, two people who chose each other for all the wrong reasons that somehow feel right. And maybe, if we're very lucky, we figure out what it means to build a life that's actually ours." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a duke or a soldier, but simply a man who understood what it meant to be trapped by other people's dreams. She thought about Thornwick Manor crumbling without her, about her mother's fury fading eventually into indifference, about the freedom that came not from wealth or titles, but from choosing your own prison and finding it wasn't a prison at all. "I'd like that," she said. James squeezed her hand. "So would I." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled warm. And two people who had run from everything they were supposed to be sat together in the growing dark, discovering that sometimes the best marriages begin with honesty about how broken you both are. Its spring came early that year. Eleanor planted a garden. James fixed the roof properly. And in the small cottage on the hillside, a duke and a lady learned what it meant to simply be two people in love, free at last.
If Eleanor and James's story warmed your heart, I'd be so grateful for a like. Tell me in the comments what moment touched you most.